Today's sermon topic is called community relations. And the bridge is part of what's about and part and parcel of what community is about. That's what we do. And so, to get started, I just want to say good morning, and it's good to be in the house of God. Good morning. Good morning. And for some of you who don't know, I've just returned from Pensacola visiting my lovely spouse, Clery, and she sends her prayer and her gratitude to you for taking such good care of me. And I am also very grateful, so thank you. And I want to thank the choir. A Bridge Over Troubled Water is not an easy song to sing, particularly if you're a soprano. And I understand that. And so I appreciate you making that effort for me and for the message, because it is connected. I want to make a connection between the Bridge Over Troubled Water and the sermon, and what the bridges are and what bridges can do. They have an advantage toward reconciliation between siblings, extended family members, races, religions, a greater community, and if we really want to dream big, the world. And so this can be a little sermon or a big sermon. It depends on what you hear. All right? So if you will, pray with me. Creator God, maker of all things, as we gather this morning, I welcome the presence of your Spirit, making this for us a holy place. I thank you for the reassurance that wherever two or more are gathered in your name, you are there too. So thank you again for being in this place. I have prepared the message that you have placed upon my heart, and I pray that the words of my mouth, the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. Loving God, clear my mind and allow my tongue to be free so that my spoken words are clear. May all ears and hearts be open to hear and to receive a message that can be difficult to hear and to live into. I pray this in your many names. Amen. Our reading from Matthew today is a continuation of Jesus presenting the ethics of God's kingdom. And it can be boiled down to the golden rule in all actuality. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's a simple statement, and yet it is extremely hard to do, especially when human emotions, or just plain humans, become involved. Okay? So let's look at our gospel reading today and see exactly what it is Jesus is asking of his listeners then, and what is Jesus asking of us today. So who is Jesus talking to in this passage, and why is he talking about murder? From what I researched, Jesus is talking to fellow Jews, and so his approach is very common. His opening words, "You have heard that our ancestors were told," is an indication that he's providing an interpretation of the command, basically not to murder. He adds that such behavior will be subject to judgment. And for most of us today, it's easy to kind of think about, well, I'm not going to commit murder. I don't do those kinds of things. I'm not a violent person. And that means actually taking someone's life. But are there other kinds of murder? Are there other kinds of deaths? And I believe that Jesus knew that we don't necessarily take someone's life, but that we do take hostages and we do take away someone's life. And so he takes the command further than the actual physical act of do not murder. He starts talking about the destructive power of anger and resentment, and I added rage and hate because they just seem to go together. And he knew that when acted upon, People had the capacity to cause great devastation to whomever those emotions were focused upon. Today, we know all too well the effect that unresolved anger has on our community. You just have to look to Uganda. Reverend Jim mentioned in his prayer today the young black man that was killed. All he had to do, the man, was use his words. I mean, a grandmother would tell somebody to use your words. You don't have to shoot first. It's in the news. Jesus also knew how damaging emotions were and are, especially when we harbor them. Nelson Mandela said, resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping that it kills your enemy. It's a bit counterproductive, but it is what happens when we harbor resentments and anger and hate and rage. It simply poisons us and has very little to no effect on the object of our disdain, if you will. But what is the message here in Jesus? What is it that we are to do besides do no harm? What happens when feelings get hurt? When our expectations aren't met by those we love, we trust, or we depend on, or even when we let ourselves down? Jesus calls his contemporaries to leave their gifts at the altar if they remember that a family member has a grudge against them, and to go and make a restitution or reconciliation. And once this is accomplished, to come back and present your gifts. It's not just a family member that Jesus is talking about here, though. He explains and includes community members also. In our daily business, things can sometimes become confused and combative. Resentment and anger begin to grow, and if left unattended, fester, and relations are damaged or destroyed, murdered. So Jesus cautions us to lose no time in settling our disagreements, in direct dealing, in using our words. And each time I had read this passage over the last couple of weeks, the word reconcile came out. The word settling with also came out. But the word judgment came out. And I don't know about you, but when I read judgment in Scripture, my knee-jerk reaction is to go, oh no, I'm going to have hellfire and damnation, and I'm not going to be able to reconcile my belief of God's love and judgment by those who would stand in judgment of me on this earth and not allow me to be judged by God's kingdom and in God's kingdom. So I digress with the judgment. But I begin to think about how one goes about reconciliation. What exactly is reconciliation? And according to Webster, my friend and dictionary, reconciliation is the act of causing two people or two groups to become friendly again after an argument or a disagreement. Or it can be the process, and here's the hard part. It can be the process of finding a way to make two different ideas, two facts that exist, to be true at the same time. How do we do that? How do we have a fact over here that's true and a fact over here that's true? Marriage equality is a perfect example of that fight, of that disjoint. So how do we do that? And that's reconciliation. As I refresh my memory of the meaning, I begin to think about my own life experiences. And the 12 steps of AA came to mind. Most of you, or some of you, know that I am in recovery. And the 12 steps basically saved my life and allowed me to come back into the folds of God's love and in the walls of this church. But I believe that the 12 steps speaks in several examples to the issue of damaging relationships. The 12 steps don't exactly use the word reconcile, they use the word amends, but it's the same. It's to go and take an inventory of yourself and look at what you've done and who you've hurt and make a list of those folks. And when you do that, then as time allows, or as your courage, because it takes courage, as your courage grows and your understanding of God's care grows, then you go and you talk to whomever you've hurt and you own your own stuff. And it allows that other person to own perhaps part of their stuff in the destruction of or the harm that has been done. It's a way to begin the healing. But I want to tell you that it doesn't always end happy. It doesn't always come out with this big smiley face. You know, it's messy. Reconciliation is a messy business, but it's necessary. To go to another person and admit you're wrong is an extremely humbling event and a position. But it's necessary because our egos are so big and we edge God out so easily. That's what ego's all about. That in order to become open and to have room to worship, we have to get all this yuck out so that we can be fully present. That's what Christ meant when he said, bring your gifts after you've made reconciliation, because now you have room and you can do your full worship. The other part of the AA reconciliation is making sure or being cognizant of your own behavior, and that as you go on your daily activities, that you say, oops, I goofed. Or I don't think they understood what I meant, which is impact and intent. And you know that there's a damage there. So, and when for me, it hurts here. I can feel it when it doesn't quite fit. And so I need to go to that person and see what's going on. Make sure it's okay. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes we have to make two facts that are equal and true reconcile. But it doesn't have to be an enemy thing, and it doesn't have to cause death. As we follow Jesus' command to reconcile, and as the anger and the resentment and the fear and the self-loathing that comes with all that begin to abate, we have room in our lives for others and the light that Reverend Jim spoke of last week. That light is rekindled in us, and it begins to shine forth with our love for God, ourselves, and our community. So it's a movement. It's a bridge that we have to make. My quandary about how to reconcile brought to mind another idea or concept. This is a new word for me, and it's Ubuntu. It's U-B-U-N-T-U. And I was introduced to it during my South African pilgrimage. And what I understood of it initially was that it was just a hospitality, kind of African tribal hospitality understanding, okay? That understanding is like the understanding the Israelites had. When a stranger came, you provided hospitality, because if you didn't, it was death. So that's a good place to start. My understanding began to grow, and it began to take on principles, ethical principles, if you will, of respect, love, kindness, and ultimately the connectedness of all humanity through community. Through community, we're connected. Because it arises from a desire to maintain healthy community, Ubuntu fosters the process of reconciliation, and it also engages in restorative justice, which is also important. This is that judgment, where that judgment comes in. Looking at it as a restorative judgment that engages victims, offenders, and community in deciding how to repair the harm caused by a crime rather than satisfying an abstract legal principle or punishment or punishing the offender. Now, what did I say? Okay? What it means to me is that if I can talk to you, and let's say that there's a law that's been broken, and Jesus is talking about that too. He says, if you find that you have something that's going on between you and someone else, and it's a law that's been broken, he says, go ahead and make good that. Go ahead and reconcile those differences so that you don't end up thrown in jail. Jesus is talking about Ubuntu. Jesus is talking about community and individualism getting lost in community. Western thinkers don't like that particular concept. We like the individual. We like to be, let me pull my bootstraps up and get going. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus knew that prisons had many forms, and when Nelson Mandela was eventually released from prison, he made a decision to speak that speaks to the very heart of this text. He said, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." He knew that there was a better way to address those whose anger and bitterness and their own hatred had placed him unjustly in prison for 27 years. That's a lot of bitterness to leave behind, but he did. His new way was from the old ways of Ubuntu. Here at Trinity MCC, you have some really great tools for reconciliation and for the process. It's the vision guidelines that Reverend Jim has introduced y'all to since he got here. You have agreed to use them during your general gatherings and also during your business meeting. And it's a good step for living into a community that is willing to face the hard work of reconciling differences so the community can become healthier. You see, it takes courage to work on reconciling our differences. And it's a great challenge for us to reconcile using the philosophies of Ubuntu, again, because of our own idea that individuality is much more valuable than the community. And the early church also had a problem with that concept, so it's not just us. Jesus knew our nature. He knew that harboring harsh emotions would cause harm. He knew that those emotions would rob us of gratifying relationships with each other. But most of all, he knew that allowing our dis-ease to remain unchallenged would close off our ability to feel God's presence, love, and grace. Jesus also knew that we would be unable to fully worship God when we are distracted and the monkey brain that keeps chattering about what we should have done, could have done. Boy, next time when I see her, I'm going to say this, It sure gets in the way. By following Jesus' call to reconciliation, we are taking an active part in restoring our relationship with one another as we restore our full connection with God. I want to close with a Martin Luther King quote. Martin Luther said that nonviolent resistors only avoid external physical violence. Nonviolent resistors not only avoid external physical violence, but also avoids internal violence of spirit. Not only does the nonviolent resistor refuse to shoot his or her opponent, but refuses to even hate them or hate the so-called enemy. The internal violence that is created by our own anger and our own resentment is what Jesus, I believe, was addressing in this passage. Thank you.